Hello, everybody. And today, what we're going to be focusing on are economic theories that result from the industrial society. So, the basic idea is that the industrialization creates a great deal of change within European society and American society and Japanese society and just about any society that it takes place on. We're going to be focusing largely on European American economic theories because of the time frame that we're in of between 1750 and 1900. So a lot of what I'm going to go through actually belongs in the 1800s. But interestingly enough, it lays the foundation for our attitudes to the issues created by an industrial society. And the biggest issue is the inequality of wealth and the distribution of wealth. Simply put, within all industrialized society, there are groups that are extremely wealthy, there are groups that are well off, there are groups that are living paycheck to paycheck, and there's groups that are struggling to get by. And this economic disparity has been a subject of reaction, of analysis for a couple of centuries. We see a lot of the things that I'm going to go through pop up in our conversations about economic class and social classes within our society today. So the premise that you want to work with is that industrialization creates a new wealthy class, and this is consistent with things that we've learned in history. Is that anytime there's new economic changes, a new elite emerges. And the thing is that a lot of people are going to notice that there's a big chunk of people who aren't doing as well as a smaller chunk are doing from industrialization. So let's go ahead and get to the main meat of all of this. So, working with industrialization, how do you deal with that issue of economic disparity? How do you deal with one group who owns the factory having extreme wealth and the group who does all the work within the factory having a wage that barely sustains them for life? So, that is the big issue that we talk about with industrialization. So one response is the deal with it response. In other words, this is the way it is. This is a result of natural law at work. That brings me to my first thing, the liberal economics argument. This is going to come out of the Enlightenment, out of Adam Smith. This idea that there's supply and demand, that some people are going to benefit, other people are not. That's the way the game plays out. There are winners, there are losers, and that is the natural result of the way we interact economically. So, a lot of liberal economics, and in the 19th century, liberal economics ties into Adam Smith ideas. In today's society, we would usually refer to this as more conservative economic theory. But what you want to understand is that they go, look, the market is the market. There are going to be winners, there are going to be losers. That's the way it goes. And the market responds to natural forces. Interrupting these natural forces is a bad idea. It's going to create more problems than solve. So let's take something as simple as wages. If wages are a response to supply and demand, then wages will always be set at the lowest point possible. And what a liberal economist would say is that that's good in the whole scheme of things because cheap labor means cheaper products for people to buy. And that's a benefit to society. So if you screw with that, if you force people's wages up, then what will happen is that prices for the products will go up. And since the cost of labor is up, the people who employ labor will go, well, I don't want to hire as many workers. So that will actually lead to fewer workers being needed, and could result in unemployment. In other words, everybody who wanted a job wouldn't be able to get one because of this kind of artificially created wage floor. This is the argument against minimum wage today. This is why people argue against raising the minimum wage is that they say if you raise minimum wage, you might have a couple workers who will have more money, but other workers will be laid off because the expense for labor will be too high. And prices are going to have to be raised, and that hurts the consumers. So The idea of liberal economics is that there's a natural rhythm of economic behavior and to let those natural rhythms play out. Now, this also ties into a new 19th century idea called social Darwinism. And social Darwinism social Darwinism plays on the idea of what Darwin argued about the theory of evolution. Darwin believed that people, or no, I'm sorry, species who could adapt to changing environments survived, while species who did not adapt or could not adapt died off. Social Darwinism applies that to human behavior. And what it basically says is that there's people who are capable of adjusting to the new economic realities. They deserve to succeed. And the people who don't have the ability to adapt, they deserve to fail. That this is a natural consequence, survival of the fittest, as the expression comes to be known. So when you focus on social Darwinism, you want to bring that idea of survival of the fittest. In other words, the person who is wealthy because they can adapt to the environment. And the person who is poor, well, according to this philosophy, it's their fault. They are lacking something that's preventing them from enjoying in the wealth. So the deal with it philosophy, in a lot of ways, we would see that today as more conservative economic theory. We would see that more tied into conservative ideals about how an economy should work. And the key phrase is laissez-faire. And laissez-faire is that basic idea of just leave things alone. For the most part, a lot of people would criticize this deal with the philosophy as being cold and heartless and ignoring the needs of people within society. And that's when we get to the there ought to be a law crowd. So the there ought to be a law crowd, what they say is, look, we're okay with industrialization. We're okay that there's some wealthy people and there are poor people. We're okay with there being an economic gap. But there should be rules in place to protect against abuse. So what this crowd wants is regulations of labor. They want the government to step in and say, okay, look, your factories need to meet a safety code. Your factories need to provide breaks for laborers. Your factories can't abuse children and can't abuse women. Remembering that in the 19th century, protecting women was seen as a social and moral obligation in a way like that wouldn't be extended to male workers. Um, so regulating labor practices would have been a goal of this crowd. And that's where you see a group of people that favor industrialization. To them, they're like, we're fine with people working in factories, but we want them protected from abuse. And that's the key thing. So minimum wage laws would actually come a little bit later, but would be in the same idea. Health regulations to help deal with city issues. If you remember, one of the big problems of industrialization was urbanization. How urbanization is provided for filthy, um, unsanitary situation. So creating health regulations that the government would enforce. Um, Urban design, where the government would assume responsibility for planning roads and planning the structure and the infrastructure of a city so that the city wouldn't be so overcrowded, so that the city would be more orderly. If you were to go to Google Maps and take a look at a street map of New York City, or take a street map look at Washington D.C., you would see that everything is laid out in a grid fashion, and that just speaks to a design that's planned out, and that's done with the idea of moving traffic, of moving people in an efficient and systematic manner. Now, of course, if you've been to New York City, you know that those streets need updating. But the idea is that urban design was a way of the government becoming more involved. The importance of understanding of sanitation. Now, I'm going to take a slight step to the side and just explain that during this period of time, there are developments in scientific understanding of what causes disease. We're starting to understand as a human species that there is this microbiology, that there are these microscopic organisms called bacteria and viruses, what we call germ theory, and that these germs are responsible for spreading diseases. Now, if you go back through history, you might remember that the Muslim world understood that a clean society promoted health, but nobody really understood why. They just understood the connection that a healthy society was also a clean society. But nobody understood that there are these microorganisms that would cause diseases once they got inside human beings. It's during the 19th century that we start to understand those things, where science starts to promote this idea that germ theory is a critical part to health. And that's when we start seeing sanitation conditions improve across industrialized societies in later 19th century. In order to do that, you need a government to kind of take responsibility for that, whether it be building sewage systems or picking up and disposing of trash. Those services government starts to provide more and more. And then the last thing is that we want to tie all of this to the expansion of suffrage, the idea that there are more voters coming from the lower classes. And if I'm a politician, that's where the numbers are. That's where my votes are going to come from. So I'm going to promote policies to attract those votes. And we're going to see political parties form that say we're going to protect laborers. We're going to improve cities. We're going to improve health. We're going to make things better for you, the voters. And the suffrage is what really leads to a lot of these changes because now more of the population can vote, put more pressure on the government to become involved. And that's the big thing with letter B that I want you to know. Letter B says the government needs to have an active role in promoting the social and economic health of its people and holding government more and more responsible for sanitation, for labor conditions, for economic prosperity. I mean, this is a changing development that leads us to our modern understanding of government. When you think about it, today we have presidents who say, here's how I'm going to create jobs. Back in the early 1800s, nobody believed the government could create jobs. That was a far fetched notion. The market would create jobs, it would be a natural thing. And the worst thing the government could do was get involved in the process. That's the deal with the crowd. But there's a new crowd that's pushing for government reforms to help deal with the negative effects of industrialization. Here's the key thing: they don't want to get rid of industrialization. They don't even want to get rid of capitalism. They still want private ownership of property. They still want people to, they accept that there will be rich people and that there will be poor people. But what they want the government to do is set laws in place and policies in place to protect the lower classes from the abuses of industrialization. To go back to A Christmas Carol is to protect the Bob Cratchits from the worst abuses of the Ebenezer Scrooges. But these people did accept that Bob Cratchit would have less than Ebenezer Scrooge. That brings me to the share the wealth group. So if you notice, if I'm going to just back up for a second, working with industrialization, these two groups are willing to work with this change. To them, this change is a good thing. One crowd says it's a good thing and the good outweighs the bad, deal with the bad. The second crowd says, hey, look, we can do something about the bad. We can sort of mitigate the negative effects. But then there's other groups who go, we're challenging industrialization. We're challenging this economic disparity. One group says we should share in the wealth. So the basic premise of the share in the wealth crowd, they say, look, we as a society are sharing in the production. We're sharing in this generation of wealth. We are all contributing to it. The factory worker and the factory owner, the labor of the factory worker is why we're becoming wealthy. So no individual is doing this. We're doing this as a community, as a group. You fill in the word. And the share the wealth said, since we're sharing in the growth of wealth, we should share in the benefits. If we are contributing labor to this process, we should all share in the benefit of it. So one group is going to form is called the utopian socialists. And this is the basis of modern socialist thinking. Utopian socialism is kind of a big umbrella term. In other words, there's lots of different ways to approach it. But utopian socialism argued that wealth should be distributed or redistributed amongst the population to create fairness. So if a factory produces $100,000 of profit and you have 50 workers working at $10 a year, I'm just making up money. The liberal economists, the capitalists would say, okay, 100,000 minus labor costs, there's 50 workers. I'm sorry, there's 100 workers at $50 a day or $50 a year. That comes out to $5,000. So 100,000 minus 5,000, that's $95,000. And the other $95,000 goes to the factory owner. So that would be the basic capitalist argument. The socialist argument says, well, let's take that $100,000 and distribute it amongst the workers more evenly. In other words, we all share it. So those 50 workers are going to get a bigger cut of that $100,000 profits. And what utopian socialism believed was that by redistributing the wealth, you could resolve all the big problems of industrialization. You could get rid of poverty, you could get rid of crime, you could deal with all of the problems if you just redistributed the wealth of a society. So the question is how do you do that? And that's where you get a lot of different answers. Robert Owen, I just want to point out Robert Owen. Robert Owen was a factory worker who said, you know what? If you, I'm sorry, I need to drink a tea. If you pay workers a higher wage than what the market dictates, and you provide workers with decent housing, and you give workers access to cheap goods. In other words, you sell goods to them at a cheaper rate than the price. In other words, you start creating perks for the workers. You'll get better production out of the worker. So Robert Owen's argument was from a factory owner's perspective. What he said was, look, hire workers, but give them a better wage than the absolute bare minimum. Give them access to really good housing instead of them living in squalor. Give them access to stores that sell goods at a very low rate. And he goes, these workers will be happier and they will work harder. And the factory will end up making more money. And there's a case where he does this in Scotland and it works. His factory becomes increasingly profitable, much more profitable than any of the other factories around. And people from all over Europe and the United States, they go to Robert Owen because he profits at a much higher level by paying his workers higher wages, basically. He never duplicates the feat again. It's a one-time deal. But that lays out an argument that factory owners should, instead of taking every possible cent they can, they should be providing better wages, better conditions as a term of the employment. Charles Fourier went a step further. His stuff is crazy. What he wanted to do was have labor kind of rotate, so everybody does different jobs throughout their lives to battle the boredom created by industrialization. And then whatever was produced was truly shared amongst the community. So Charles Fourier is arguing more for commune living. And kind of, if you've ever heard of a commune where people kind of come together, they produce and then they share it equally amongst themselves. And there's really no distinction between who's better and who's worse. If you're rotating jobs, you kind of get rid of that basis for discrimination. That's basically Charles Fourier's idea. There's one more thing that you should add in with the share of the wealth. And this kind of goes beyond Owen and Fourier. And this is what we see as socialism today, is that the government needs to step in and distribute the wealth amongst the people who need it. So socialism today says the government kind of takes wealth and then decides who gets what. So now you have a central authority deciding, well, okay, here's how I'm going to distribute wealth and services. And the idea is to give to the people who need more, and to the people who need less, don't give them as much. So that involves a redistribution of wealth to try and deal with the problems created by an industrialized society, particularly from the economic inequality. And I know that at this point, a lot of you are going, wait a minute, that's stuff that I argue against or I argue for. And that's because this is the basis for modern attitudes towards the role of government. All right, then you've got your fight the system crowd. So we go one more step to a group of people who go industrialization is the final step before we get to a big revolution. And this is your Marxism, communism. A lot of people, what they perceive to be communism is in fact socialism. Communism kind of goes further than what socialism would do. But there's a lot of parties that call themselves the Communist Party when in fact they're just a version of a socialist party. So Marxism, communism, we can kind of lump those together, but there are some very important differences. So an economic philosopher named Karl Marx proposed an alternative vision of society. And what Karl Marx said was that there are two groups of people in the world. There's two communities. There's the proletariat. And the proletariat, they're the working stiffs. They're the working class. They're the factory workers who work on the factory floor. They're the factory worker was the big one. And then there's the bourgeoisie. They're the property owners. They're the ones who benefit from the labor of the proletariat. And what Karl Marx said is that this social class tension has been going on forever. In other words, ever since we've had society, we've had this relationship between the master and the slave, as he said, between the freeman and the serf, between the landowner and the peasant. He's basically saying all of history, you are either the one who benefits from other people's labor or you are the one who provides labor for other people's benefits. And what Karl Marx said is that industrialization made the distinction very obvious. And the proletariat, that working class, they were being treated more and more like just a piece of machinery. And when that piece breaks, you replace them. So the worth of a person, the worth of a human being, was judged by their ability to produce. That was all. So what Karl Marx was saying was that this situation is growing and growing. There's two separate camps. And the more industrialized a society is, the more distinct those two groups are. And this group of the proletariat would develop what's called a revolutionary consciousness. In other words, the proletariat would all wake up one day and go, wow, we're getting screwed here. And the proletariat would say, no more. We're not going to be treated like piece of machineries. We are going to take control. And what Marx believed would happen would be the proletariat would rise up in widespread rebellion and overthrow the bourgeoisie government. And they would establish a new government where there would be no class, there would be no private property, the wealth would be shared amongst the community, and you wouldn't even need government. And that is ultimately the end game of communism. Because what communism kind of is seen as is a series of, it's a sequence of steps, a sequence of historical developments that is all accumulating into the end game, where there would be no more private property. There would be the people would be in control of everything. The laborers, the factory workers would own the factories. The banks would be controlled by the people. The farmers would own the land. Black Widow would not get a funeral while Iron Man did. These would all be the natural results of this endgame. So what's important about this socialism and communism is that they are proposing a whole different attitude towards society, an alternative view of what society could look like, creating a society without classes. These are revolutionary ideas. And there's different attitudes about how to reach them. You'll see how communism will transform in the 20th century. The communism of Cuba and the communism of China, the communism of Soviet Union all look different from each other and different from Marxism. So that's the second type of responses. Now, the third to me is more social. So industrialization creates this attitude of what are we losing in embracing an industrial world. So now it's not so much about economic disparity, even though that certainly ties in. It's becoming more about social changes, about the destruction of traditional norms and values. And again, if this sounds familiar, it's because, well, history tends to repeat. We're still dealing with this. So, one of the responses to the changing times of the 19th century is Romanticism. Romanticism is an artistic movement, a poetry movement, a literature movement. It's a very broad terminology. And what Romanticism does is a couple things. One, it emphasizes the importance of nature and emotions. So, in the face of a growing urban environment, the romantics say, but we need to stay in touch with nature. We need to still connect with the outside. We need to connect with the countryside. So there's going to be kind of a glorification of natural environments. This is why parks start to get built into the 19th century cities. Romanticism also is going to glorify the past. It's going to start saying, wow, back in the day, we didn't have these problems. It was so much simpler. And this is a very common theme. This is a much simpler time. It was a better time. It wasn't as complicated as today is. We've lost so much. So when we talk about romanticizing the past, this is a very common feature of human beings, at least modern human beings. We tend to look to the past and say, oh, things were so much better when. And that is a very common theme. We see it today. People talking about life was so much better before social media, which actually I do agree with. But the point is that I'm romanticizing the past. I'm choosing to forget, or I'm choosing to gloss over some unpleasant truths that have been dealt with since then. So romanticism also glorifies emotion. And if you think about the Enlightenment and the industrialization, when you start dealing with natural laws and machines, you start creating a life that is largely mechanical. There's no joy, there's no spontaneity in such a predictable world. So romanticism's emphasis on emotion is a rejection of that rigidity that the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution brought about. We also get new sciences, and this is getting a little ahead of ourselves. But the new sciences, particularly Einstein, is going to start rejecting this mechanical order of the scientific revolution of people like Newton. Basically, to make a long story short, the Isaac Newtons and the Galileos said the world is a big machine and it works according to fixed laws. Einstein and his peers came along and said, not so much. The world is a lot more, or the universe is a lot more chaotic. The universe is much more unstable. We see order because we are making order out of our own minds. In other words, we look at chaos and we derive the order. But that doesn't mean it's orderly. It's sort of like when you look at clouds and you derive a shape. There's that cloud is not that shape. The cloud is chaos. The cloud is a random convergence of water vapor. But we give it order. This is what the new sciences are doing. Einstein's going to come up with a theory called the theory of relativity, where the measurement of an object depends on the person measuring it. It depends on their perspective. So you can have two different measurements both be correct because the measurers are at different points. Don't ask me to go into more detail than that. This is going to have a profound influence on the mechanical view and the logical view of the Enlightenment. It's going to start challenging that. And we'll see that challenge particularly in theater, literature, and art. And with Romanticism, I always point you back to A Christmas Carol. You know, A Christmas Carol is a criticism of the industrialized world, arguing that the industrialization of English society is robbing people of its humanity. In realism, We see a movement that deals with social issues. And there's a playwright named Ibsen who wrote A Doll's House. And in A Doll's House, um, the middle class wife who lives the middle class wife's dream. If you guys remember, Rousseau talked about separate spheres, that a woman's place was in the home and she was there to take care of children and tend to the husband's needs because that was her natural place. In A Doll's House, the author gets to how unhappy the woman is living in the separate spheres model. And at the end of the play, she ends up walking out on her husband, which in the 1860s, 1870s would have blown everybody's mind. But it did start dealing with the idea of we have this philosophy of separate spheres, which is supposedly based on nature, but we have a lot of unhappy women. And we have women who are emotionally and mentally unhappy. And we've got to deal with this real problem. So the willingness to call out hypocrisy, the willingness to call out challenges is a mark of this movement. And then lastly, this is the birth of modern art. Up to this point, art had very strict rules to follow. And now we get a bunch of artists who start to reject those rules and start to express themselves artistically differently. They start to get to more subjective interpretations of an object. And these are going to include some of the big heavy hitters of art, of modern art, like Monet. Wow, I'm having a tough day. Monet, Van Gogh, and Picasso. And so modern art starts to reject this kind of mechanical view of how to do art and this literal interpretation of the subject of art, creating much more of a subjective interpretation. And this, of course, is going to lead into a lot of the 20th century. So we can see in this last thing the changing times, and we can also see with with all three topics that I covered in this lecture, we can see a lot of connection to today. This is us transitioning into the modern mindset. And with that, as always, you bring your questions to the class. And this wraps up Unit 5 on industrialization. This is also going to be the last lecture for semester A. When we come back in semester B in a couple of weeks, we'll pick up with imperialism and we'll keep moving along. So I hope all is well, and I will see you next time. Bye.